Thank you for joining us at the Evolution of Medicine Summit. A warm welcome. We wanted to make a specific thank you to our sponsors that have made this event possible. Energetics, an innovative natural remedy and supplement company, is committed to revitalizing medicine, and Cyrex Labs, a clinical immunology laboratory specializing in functional immunology and autoimmunity. Most of all, thank you for listening. If you'd like to share this with your colleagues and friends on Facebook if you enjoy the content, and if you have questions, you can ask us on Twitter with the hashtag EvoMed. Finally, if you really want to play your part in accelerating the evolution of medicine, ask your doctor if the Evolution of Medicine Summit might be right for them. Thank you and enjoy. All right, hello and welcome back to the Evolution of Medicine Summit. This is James Maskell, and we've got another exceptional talk coming up here today. I'm so glad to have Sayer G here on the line, and Sayer is all the way from Naples, Florida. He's the founder of Green Med Info. He's an author, researcher, lecturer, and also on the advisory board of the National Health Federation. And Sayer is very passionate in a lot of areas, but what we're going to talk about today is the evolution of the medical evidence base, because this is really what's driven medicine up until now. And I think that Sayer has a unique perspective in understanding where it's been and where it's going and why this is such an important part of medicine. So thanks so much for being here, Sayer. Good to have you here on the line. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thank you for having me. This is a topic that I find extremely exciting because our mission, Agreement Info, was really based on getting people that information that they might not know is readily available to them already through the National Library of Medicine. So there's quite a lot of data available, and certainly there's been quite a radical shift in the nature of access to this type of information. So I commend you for this summit. I think it's a great idea.
Thanks, Sayer. No, well, let's just start with that. We have seen in the digital age, an access to information that has not been there before. Why don't we just start with that? Well, can you maybe take us, for our listeners who, aren't so much aware of it, before we get into why the medical base needs to evolve, can you just take us give us sort of a historical understanding of how medical information came about, how it's funded, how it works, so we can see how it's going to shift from here on out?
Absolutely. One thing that might be worth just mentioning on the outset is the fact that most of the medical knowledge that, has helped our species get to where we are today has been passed down primarily through the oral tradition. And so we have this amazing context, really, to look at medicine when you think about just the ancient ways in which people use plants and foods to maintain their health and genetic integrity. But what we have today is this dramatic shift into the biomedical universe, where you have all this peer-reviewed and published research that is now housed on what is equivalent to the medical convolution of the global brain. We talk about the internet. We have this almost speed of light access now to all the information that is now housed in this kind of collective consciousness. So when you go to Google, of course, you type in a keyword and you get millions of results on almost any topic you can think of. Well, most people don't realize this, but because of a lot of taxpayer money, the National Library of Medicine built this massive database of 23 million bibliographic citations from, biomedicine and life sciences, and you can access it for free. It's basically available through PubMed.gov, one of the search engines that is available to use for free. And this was not the case originally. In fact, when they started to make available access to Medline, this was from back in 1971. First of all, the modem speeds were so slow. It was basic dial-up. So even if you wanted to access it, you had to pay approximately $80 an hour, and you had to be part of a private, institution. And then what happened was that in 1996, they released it for free home computer-based searching. And it wasn't until really 1997, it was actually Al Gore who demonstrated the first free public access to this amazing treasure house. So that is actually one of our core missions at Agreement Info, is not actually for people just to go to our site and look at the data that we've collected, but rather pass through us and help make aware the accessibility of this amazing data.
Yeah, that is amazing. It's a 180-degree shift from information just being held by a very few people to, accessible to everyone.
Mhm.
So if you, let's just say you haven't been paying attention since 1996, what have you been missing? What have been the major shifts that you've seen in this evidence base?
Well, what's fascinating, of course, is just how much capital it takes to produce the type of research that will actually drive a product into the market and then eventually become part of the standard of care. So, statin drugs, for example, for primary and secondary prevention of cardiovascular disease and cardiac mortality, basically, it takes about $802 million on average to get a starter compound to go through the phase 0, 1, 2, 3 trials so that you can finally slap down an application on the FDA's table and see whether they'll accept it. And that's a massive amount of capital that will never be available, obviously, to non-patented substances. So by definition, unfortunately, FDA drug approval almost exclusively, although there are exceptions now with approvals of botanicals like sort of bloodroot, and now there's functional foods. So things are opening up a little. But generally, what happens is if a drug has received FDA approval, it is usually a synthetic compound or xenobiotic. So one of the things I've observed in this process is that you have all this money flowing into getting these novel patented pharmaceuticals to receive approval. Billions of dollars are at stake. But in the process of doing that, James, what's so interesting is this is really what I see in the evolution of medicine is that they've spent billions of dollars studying natural compounds to look for lead compounds that they can then alter down the road to produce a drug. So inadvertently, they have basically opened up approximately 400,000 different studies on natural compounds, in many cases not only confirming their traditional use as a therapeutic, but in some cases showing the superiority of those agents, at least in the cell, animal, and then sometimes you're lucky enough to find human study model.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I was talking about with this someone else the other day is that when you have these studies and then they're anchored against the placebo, we actually have a ton more information about the placebo than we think we have as well because it's been studied in almost everyone as well. So, it's interesting to see these other types of things coming out. So, if we look back in the last 100 years, what's been driving the medical
Yeah.
evidence base?
Well, it's a great question. Again, it really comes down to capital. Because, if you're a shareholder of a corporation, say a pharmaceutical company, basically there's a fiduciary responsibility that that company and their officers make money for those shareholders. So the primary objective, of course, then is to produce a substance that is biologically novel. Because once you produce a statin, of course, there's all these Me Too drugs that come up because the patent will run out and you can't obviously mark it up and claim it's the magical cure. So, what's happening is that there's this profound, I think, awareness generally now that this is a extremely faulty model, and it was actually the researcher John Ioannidis who showed only in 2005. Okay, this was the most downloaded publication from the Public Library of Sciences Open Access Journal ever, which was why most published research findings are false. So there's a general seismic shift occurring, which is that the evidence-based model of medicine is actually not founded on that empiricism and evidence that we really believed almost as sort of a faith-based certainty existed. And this is something that I would want to point out is that basically what we're seeing in the evolution of medicine today towards the, again, evidence-based model, which is an extremely loaded word because it implies that if you haven't verified through, high quality, multi-center, placebo-controlled, randomized clinical trials, and then meta-analyses on top of them, that something is actually helpful, then you can't say that it's true. So basically, it's almost like a pyramidal power structure where unfortunately, the gold standard is that those who own the gold, make the rules. The golden rule, and so it implies almost like Napoleonic law that what has not been explicitly confirmed to be therapeutic is by default then not therapeutic or doesn't exist in the realm of a legal and appropriate medication. And what this does, of course, is it denies all of natural medicine by implication.
That's so interesting. There was a certain shift near the beginning of this century where pharmaceutical companies sort of saw evidence-based medicine rather than a problem as an opportunity. Can you just sort of explain to the readers that shift that occurred?
Yeah, it's very interesting because it has to do too with a concept called governmentality, which the French philosopher Michel Foucault identified as being a big part of why we do medicine today. Basically, it's about trying to get governing bodies to use medicine as a way to control or to implement the policies of their government. He also called it biopower and biopolitics. And basically, medicine is intertwined with government. And it's a way of controlling populations, okay? Which you need to control populations. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy or that it's always bad. But so what's happened is that with the industrial revolution and really just this burgeoning chemical industry, there was a refinement of the ability to target on a molecular level, basic physiological processes. And so that model then really kind of infected the medical practice and used the evidence-based model to really, drive home that this is the only valid form of medicine. And I think it was primarily because of a economic pressure, of course. The actual epistemology or the sort of the concepts that go into saying this is valid is completely false, because see, what basically we're saying today is that the evidence-based model says that the evidence of your eyes and your doctor's eyes are not as valid as these high-level controlled studies. And so what that does effectively is it disempowers the physician, clinician on the front lines who is seeing real phenomena. It's not considered valid, of course, unless it's been proven through this elaborate, capital-intensive process. And ultimately, once the standard of care is determined, if a physician were to violate that or deviate, then they could actually be subject to some type of penalty, if not even a legal penalty. So, if they refuse a vaccine for their patient, then that patient gets a quote vaccine preventable disease, and suddenly that patient can even sue them. So it's a power structure that's very hard to disengage from. But that's also one reason why I love what we do, because we are basically taking all of the research that is peer-reviewed and published on the benefits of natural compounds or interventions that are, within the CAM umbrella, like yoga and meditation and even watchful waiting. And then we're taking all the studies that were basically ignored, showing the unintended adverse effects of very commonly used drugs and food additives and unnecessary interventions. So, like, for example, we have a page on statin drugs, which shows 300 different adverse health effects, and this is directly from the National Library of Medicine. So the biggest criticism of the movement of integrative and functional and natural alternative medicine is that there's no evidence, like it's all anecdote. And what I'm saying is that absolutely not. In fact, you go on Medline right now through PubMed.gov and you search the complementary medicine filter, and you'll find almost 900,000 studies that are now in that data bank. And each study approximately represents the scientific labor of, on average, 3 scientists for maybe 4 months. That's a year's worth of scientific labor. And that's equivalent to like 900,000 years of, time studying the topic.
That's amazing, and that's available. So it seems like more what the role is of someone like GreenMed Info and yourself is not so much just creating the information, but just getting the information and putting it into a usable framework for people to understand and to take advantage of the information. Because it sounds like the information's been there for a while now, right?
Absolutely. And of course, when, through the lens of the evidence-based model, okay, the top tier of truth, of course, is that it has to be, verified through a, clinically, sort of a randomized, double-blind, clinically controlled study that unless you have that level of evidence, animal studies don't mean anything, et cetera, or just case studies. Well, that whole model, again, is what I personally think is completely bankrupt. And so what we're doing is sort of almost archiving these indications that, at least in the preclinical research mostly, yes, okay, multi-drug resistant cancers. I can't tell you how many studies we have showing compounds like curcumin, the primary polyphenol from turmeric, inducing programmed cell death, when some of the chemo agents that were derived from agents of war, basically like mustard-based agents of war, don't even have that ability. So when you see studies like that, it's so encouraging, and you realize that, okay, of course, it's not going to make it to a human trial unless we, activate and we say, well, we're taxpayers, we want this to happen, because it just costs too much money. And that's not a good reason, obviously, to separate yourself from the truth.
Yeah,
Really.
absolutely, absolutely. So, if we just come back to this concept of the evolution of medicine, when I say those words, what does it sort of resonate with you as far as your understanding of this evolution of medicine?
Well, I love the fact that with your advocacies, there's a very positive tone. You're really looking at what we can do, to improve the model. I do that, but I also have to acknowledge one of the fundamental perils involved in this present medical model, which is, the evolution is actually towards a very disturbing place in the sense that, for example, what we're doing today with the evidence-based model is saying that if you can see something and prove it logically, mathematically, empirically, then it's a real phenomena and it's relevant to the practice of medicine. But if you can't see it, then the assumption is that it's not relevant or doesn't even exist. And that's a form of positivism, right? The belief that if you can't see it, then it just doesn't even exist. And really, what I'm saying is that modern, let's say, diagnostic technology, as an example, literally bloodlessly vivisects the human body, rendering it into just carrion. Or like if you're looking at neuroscience and psychiatry, you basically assume that consciousness is to the brain what urine is to the kidney. That there's no functional state of the brain. There's just it's an organic realm, and basically our bodies are basically objects of study in this universe of looking at it. And I guess what I'm saying is that that's a devolution, that's a degeneration of medicine. Because, for example, thermography, you can't see the same microcalcifications as an X-ray, okay? So you're not going to see the DCIS microcalcifications very clearly, perhaps, but you'll see the physiology and you'll see the thermal signatures that indicate that, yeah, there's upregulation of cyclooxygenase, and that maybe because they have a arachidonic-rich or omega-6 fatty acid-rich diet, and you're seeing this 5 to 10 years before there's even a lesion that you can, ascertain through an X-ray. And so really, I mean, it's kind of crazy. Like, we know this to be truth. We know human physiology, and we have the instrumentation even to access information. But, again, thermography is considered not as evidence-based, because of that, labile and information-dense kind of situation.
So, where do you see this going? What's your hope for this evolution of the evidence base?
Well, what I see happening is that people are finally becoming aware that there is clinical research supporting common interventions or anecdotes. Okay, so for example, I was shocked recently to find in the journal of, was actually the International Journal of Rheumatic Diseases, that they compared Tylenol to basically tahini, right? Just taking sesame-rich tahini, and they found that the participants who received the sesame had superior pain relief versus Tylenol. And so there are studies now that are coming up that are confirming, things that grandma might have said. Wow, I had some, sesame seed last night and I don't feel pain this morning. Well, now we can understand that these foods are powerful regulators of the very pathways that, in some part, thanks to the sort of molecular science, we now know because of drug research how they operate. And so we're kind of seeing a complete renaissance in ways. And I think, as you know, of course, functional medicine is one of those indications. And it's so interesting to me that basically the Institute for Functional Medicine was started in 1993 by Jeffrey Bland, right, and Susan. But basically that's around the same time that the evidence-based practice started to be really gaining ground. So really we see these parallel processes, and they don't mutually exclude each other entirely. Like, for example, there's a British medical journal study just published showing that antibiotics are not more effective than watchful waiting for upper respiratory tract infections in children. So that was using the evidence-based model, doing a review of the literature, and it clearly showed that this common form of practice that was the rule of thumb, and many people just do it, because they feel they have to intervene in that situation, is outdated. So I'm not saying all evidence-based medicine is problematic, but we definitely have to look at it as having complexity.
Yeah, it certainly is complex. And this is happening right now where big organizations, it's happening in England, it's happening in America, are saying to companies that are doing this research that maybe in the past has just not published the research that doesn't fit their agenda, that now all research has to be published so that we can actually see what's real. Can you just talk
Yeah.
to that whole, because I know that's like a whole
Yeah.
can of worms that we're opening up, but is it, my understanding is that in the past, people doing the research didn't have to publish if it didn't fit with their initial conclusion or their initial hypothesis, and now they are going to have to. And can you just sort of explain
Yeah.
that whole world? Because I think this is
Yeah.
really the evolution. It's like trying to get some more honesty into into a sort of a corrupt system.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the biggest criticism of the evidence-based model, right? Because the evidence itself that, gives it credibility, there's no legal obligation for a researcher or a research team to publish the study. And so if it's a negative finding or a null finding, it's not calculated as part of the general body of information that leads to the decision in that model. So ethically, of course, there's an obligation, because without that data, then we don't have a fair evidence-based assessment. So what they're doing is they're now requiring that these trials get registered publicly, and so that there is a way to follow up, and if a research team shows a negative or null finding, then it'll be public record, and it'll be kind of calculated. The bigger issue, I think, is actually ghostwriting, and this has happened with some very well-known trials, especially for antidepressants, and basically some really big names. Okay, this is almost like a religion. You have these huge scientists in their fields who are like considered priests or saints, and in this model, people just have this faith that they signed off on this document, so it's got to be true. And it's been found that it's extremely compromised, the entire system. And there aren't enough checks and balances, and ultimately there's so much riding on the line. Now, for me, it's clear that you can't take, let's say, fluoxetine, the fluoride-based antidepressant known as Prozac, and administer that to someone and expect that to have long-term beneficial effects, because obviously it's a chemical that no cell in the body had any previous experience dealing with. Thank God we have the cytochrome P450 enzymes to basically deal with these novel new compounds. But regardless, it's just common sense, really. Like, you wouldn't use fluoride-based chemicals that target the brain in ways we don't understand to improve, quote, depression, which, there's a lot to be depressed about anyway. And the flip side of depression is, if you truly appreciate life and understand the dark side and the suffering, then you experience just as much joy on the other end. I mean, that's just reality. So the whole thing is just so sad, really.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. Well, I'm glad that the truth is certainly starting to come out more, and all of these studies starting to get published. So, what happens in a situation? Can you talk through maybe some historical precedents of where the science definitely pointed in one way, and now it definitely points in another way, and sort of like the mechanism by which we suddenly, we as a population start to realize that what we've taken as truth is no longer truth, and, and sort of the process that happens? Because I think we're in the middle of that with a number of different interventions, and it's just like how far through that process we are. So do you have some historical precedent for that?
Well, I would say if we look at the original development of the vaccines that were used for polio, for example, they used the cells of other animals, like, the green monkey kidney cells. At the time, they didn't even know what reverse transcriptase was, right? An enzyme that enabled a virus to insert itself into the DNA of an infected cell and become part of it forever. And so basically, when they were doing these developments, they didn't understand that those cells could contain these viruses, which can cause all types of severe immune suppression as well as all types of cancer as a result. And now we know that this is the case, and millions were infected with them. In fact, that's why vaccine development is really moving quickly to phase out the live or weakened polio vaccine, because unfortunately it does cause a vaccine-specific type of infection that can lead to polio paralysis and related irreversible neurological damage. So, that's one of the things about the science, is that now that the way that we do vaccine science, of course, and safety science is that we use the passive surveillance, which is extremely unethical because you don't just, you should test the vaccine for safety with a non-vaccinated control group, which they never do. They give them some other vaccine full of adjuvants and other things that can cause harm, and they never actually really prove whether they're more effective than doing nothing at all, or maybe let's try even better and give them some type of immune support. So the whole thing is that when you look at the science itself for many of these interventions, it's so shoddily put together to start with, and now that we have these many decades of research showing all the unintended adverse effects of these interventions, it's much easier to kind of want to return to nutrition based medicine, which is really, I think, the key.
Yeah. Well, take us through like the journey of something like Vioxx, right? Vioxx, which was, went through all the trials, completely approved, used by millions of people, and then proven to be a real problem. What does that look like from the scientific point of view?
Well, again, that's an interesting topic because we use so many non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, aspirin and ibuprofen now. This is one thing I have noticed, James, is that the amount of research now that shows the adverse effects are probably causing far more harm than any, perceived benefit is just so disturbing. Even some pretty high impact factor journals like Lancet are publishing research on ibuprofen being as cardiotoxic as Vioxx. So we literally tens of thousands of people could be killing themselves with ibuprofen. And ibuprofen, is a weird chemical because at the time that they developed it, they were basically producing it so that it had a ghost mirror image molecule. So there's two different chemicals in ibuprofen. They're mirror images, and one of them, is in the wrong direction. Like you put a beam of polarized light through those, and it goes in the left or right direction. Well, that's the thing is Aleve or naproxen doesn't have that other badly rotating molecule, and that's why it doesn't have the cardiotoxicity. So, again, all these drugs have been on the market for trillions of doses, and it's only after people start really drawing these connections. Oh, wow, he took it every day, and he died of a heart attack, and so did my neighbor, and it's just, this is the wrong way to go about it. Like, the model, of course, James, for drug development is you do in vitro studies to try to, out of the literally billions of compounds you could study in nature to try to find one that could be turned into a drug. Then you do an animal study and you do toxicology study where you show, what dose kills 50% and the LD50, right? And then from there you extrapolate and try to figure out what an acceptable level of harm is for a human based on the body weight differences. And so it's just such an absurd model that's really assumes that you're going to be poisoned. It's just a matter of how much, and it doesn't obey the precautionary principle. So I think the evolution of medicine today is moving towards recognizing the precautionary principle is essential. If a company is going to release onto the market a chemical or a drug that they're saying is safe and effective, then they've got to prove it effectively. I mean, they have to show that. And unfortunately for them, it's unethical. You can't say, prove a chemical safe in children or infants when you don't want to administer that chemical to them because it's going to poison them. So it's just so ridiculous, the system.
Well, let me just go a bit further into that because, one of the things that I've seen studies starting to come out is intergenerational toxicity, where you have a toxic buildup that's happening from generation to generation. You have kids now with, proven maybe hundreds of chemicals in their bloodstream. So are we not getting to a point, the reason why this is really interesting to me, say, is that my original training was as an economist. Huh. And in economics, we have this concept of an externality. So you might think of something like pollution. So if you move to LA, in 1920, there was no pollution. You could have a fire, you could have a bonfire in the back of your house every day, and you weren't taking into account the cost of it. You could buy a car, you could have a whole fleet of cars, and you wouldn't take any account because it just disappeared into the air. And this was a cost that you were sort of delivering to society that wasn't being paid for by anyone. And so this tends to go along quite well until you get to a point where everyone's doing it, and there's too much, and you overrun the natural amount, and then you start to see symptoms of those problems. And then it's, so this externality by its very nature is difficult to measure and is classically always undermeasured. And, you actually start to see the problems of these issues when you have an ecology that is a closed loop. So like in the earth, we have a closed loop, but the human body is surely a perfect example of that. So, from an economist's point of view, I look at the human body and say, look, it's extremely intertangled between each of the different systems and how it works. This is like a breeding ground for negative externalities. And the fact that we don't see them popping up and we don't recognize them is just a function of what they are, which is difficult to measure, and by their nature. And so I guess, ever since I understood that and I've been applying it to medicine, I see potentially every intervention that's come along is just a negative externality that's waiting to happen. And so how do you see that we're going to evolve to deal with this problem? Because reductionism has sort of left us to this point where we're going to do some damage that we're not going to walk away from.
No, I think you bring up a great point, which is that we can no longer consider ourselves, medically, hermetically sealed off from the environment, obviously. And environmental medicine is going to be key in really addressing any of the symptoms that are presently being treated with symptom suppressive chemicals, novel patented chemicals. So it's this vicious cycle, obviously, of not seeing the symptom as an attempt of the body to heal, albeit at times to such extremes that the body even dies. I'm not painting a picture of the body as this just always perfect self-healing entity, but the idea is that we are presently experiencing unprecedented changes in the environment where we're breathing in the Roundup, the glyphosate, and still people think the non-GMO movement is a bunch of activists that should just stop it and stop being so precautionary and raising red flags. But the reality is that if the medical model can't take into account these inevitable exposures and their effects on health, then it's really not going to serve anybody. So, I definitely see what you're saying.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point. So, moving forward from here, most medical interventions that we have now have this big group of evidence that points in one direction and another group of evidence that points in the other. As an example, you say something like acupuncture. Like every person I've met in America who's in the allopathic world thinks that acupuncture is bogus. And they have tons of studies to be able to prove it. And then, you go to someone in the Eastern world where like acupuncture is the same and they have, generations and generations of studies that prove that acupuncture is safe and effective for these types of things. Now, what are we going to do about acupuncture? Because no one can really agree in the point. Like, how are we ever going to decide whether these are effective interventions when we have tons of evidence on both sides?
That's a great question. I mean, at Green Med Info, we have 147 articles now on acupuncture, and it shows its value, I think, in how many different diseases? 134. They even use, they placebo control these trials as well by doing the sham acupuncture treatment. So, they're really trying their best to model the evidence-based system, and I think it's pretty clear that the reality again is that if something works. And it's believed to have worked, let's say, in the Chinese medical system for thousands of years, then that, for me personally, is fine. Like I need to experience it for it to be real for me. But the evidence-based medical model, at least the characterization of it that goes to extremes, is saying that no, it doesn't matter. Like that's quackery. Skeptically speaking, if it hasn't been proven, then it doesn't exist, and that's just woo. And unfortunately, this is sort of the situation we're in. But yeah, Green Med, we do go out of our way to index therapeutic actions and have presently about, I think, 400 of them indexed. Anything from chewing gum has actually been studied to things like, just dietary modifications of all kind, like raw food, exercise. So many things we can do that don't require we put something into our mouth. Even natural medicine sometimes is guilty of that. We don't want to reproduce the palliative model of suppressed symptoms, but instead use a natural compound. We'd rather remove the chemical toxicity and whatever interference is going on for the body to heal itself and, of course, nourish it on a deep level. And, you did bring up that point about this multi-generational effects of a lot of these exposures. Like we know with BPA, we know with certain types of chemical compounds that they can integrate into the germline cell, which is going to become the future offspring of our species, and can forever alter the health of the next generation. So, these are very important issues that you're bringing up.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I just feel like this is a huge topic. So, the doctors of the future, if you go back 30 years ago, right, the doctors, how would they get their evidence base? They would get their evidence base from reading the journals. Their sales rep would come in with the information. I mean, we're all in a big shift here. Now, obviously, as well as websites like yourself, there are different organizations that are using different evidence bases to teach different models of medicine, like functional medicine, which has systems biology as its core rather than sort of the reductionist model of taking each part of the body separately. What do you see moving forward from here? Like, how is the evidence base going to be used, and how do you see that that's going to affect medicine? And I would start by wearing your rose-tinted sunglasses here. Say, like, what would you hope to happen moving forward?
Okay, well, what I'd love to see happen is for people to start looking at food not just as a source of caloric content or building blocks for their body, but as a source of information that has literally millions of years of evolution behind it. Meaning, when a plant produces a compound, as a response to stress, let's say it's resveratrol, in a grape, that compound actually starts to target genes within the mammal's body, our own bodies, that conserve energy and basically model caloric restriction. So longevity pathways are opened up because for so many countless years, those two species, that plant and our predecessors, evolved so that message of future scarcity would be transferred to our bodies. So in other words, food and phytocompounds and the density of information within it is so sacred. And when we start to, let's say, alter the structure by inserting some gene from another creature into a food we're going to eat, the unintended adverse effects of that are immense because they've altered dramatically the information that we need to hold our health up together from the ground up, So I think there's a shift definitely towards understanding food and natural compounds as being the, quote, ultimate pharmaceuticals in the sense of being able to be pleiotropic, to be able to, be the poly pill that all the drug companies have been trying to find. Turmeric's a perfect example. We have looked at all 6,000 studies on Medline on the topic of its benefits and have about 1,500 of them on our site. And it shows that there's 165 different physiological, cellular, molecular pathways that it modulates. This is happening all simultaneously. So the density of information in that compound is impossible for us to ever understand. We could never understand the exact mechanism by which it helps with, good Lord, what is it? Almost 600 different disease states so far. So, that's the beauty of it, is kind of going back to food as medicine, or even better, food is that which prevents us from needing, quote, medicine. And that's where traditional recipes even start to form a centerpiece for medical intervention and prevention, because the recipe means literally in French medical prescription. So, we're getting back to, I think, this older awareness of the essential and sacred role of food in medicine.
And do you think that's the evolution basically caused by the fact that these diseases that we have now are born of those causes?
Yeah, like for example, cancer. Everyone's like, oh, we need to find a cure for cancer and we don't know what's causing it. It's just so untrue because after doing this project and looking through literally tens of thousands of abstracts on the topic, it's so clear. There's about 1,000 ways to induce cancer in an experimental model, and it's almost always by introducing some type of chemical or some type of viral vector that's an oncogenic vector, or depleting some nutrient. So obviously we know that that's what cancer is, and we know that it's not chemotherapy deficiency; it's a deficiency of these basic factors. Clean air, water, and of course there's the mind-body connection. So ultimately, I think that to that point now, where we're seeing the diseases, as they're called, that have been arrayed for us in this bestiary of modern medicine, right? That there's these targeted pharmaceuticals that we have to try to take them out with is just so bankrupt and so ridiculous. Like, the symptom is not the disease, and by throwing a fancy Latin or Greek name on top of it or some mathematical algorithm, you're not doing anything at all. You're basically giving up at the symptom, not trying to understand the cause of it, because you remove the cause and then you have the cure, right? This is obvious and sort of ancient as Hippocrates and many traditions before him.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an interesting point to to think about that return. So if you take off your rose-tinted sunglasses and you start to look at reality, I see that there are obviously powerful interests that have an important stake in the status quo. Do you think this is going to get worse before it gets better, or are you seeing green shoots that you think will take us in a positive direction?
It's a great question. I mean, I really think that it's happening, that people are waking up, obviously, to the importance of using food as medicine and reducing exposures to chemicals. It's not happening fast enough, in my opinion. And I think that the best thing we can do, of course, is to live it in our own lives and choose, with our fork and our dollar to change the way medicine is working, because it really is based largely on economic processes. The financial realities are what's driving a lot of this. And I feel that, people are the good news when it comes to severe diseases. It cuts across every possible line that exists: gender and, socioeconomic and class. It's basically going to wake everyone up, because the sickness just autism spectrum disorder alone, that is just screaming to us that we need to acknowledge the actual causes of disease and obviously implement safe, effective, time-tested, affordable alternatives. And that's really what we have before us. And I can say, thanks to the research that's available, it's no longer easy to just tell people, well, that's just quackery, or there's no evidence for it, because the evidence-based model of medicine has now been clearly shown that up to 90% of the published findings are actually false. We know how the process works. It's really an excreta of the drug industry, and the pharmaceutical industry is an excreta of the chemical industry. And the game is up. I mean, I think people can clearly see these basic realities.
I mean, yeah, it's easy to see when you look at, say, something like, well, look, if America's taking this many drugs and, they're all showed to be evidence-based for whatever we're doing, then, right, we're obviously the healthiest nation on earth, right?
Absolutely. I mean, of all the countries in the world that vaccinate their children, okay, we have like the 33rd worst infant mortality rate, and yet we vaccinate our infants more than any other country in the world. So can someone please explain to me why you can't even mention autism and vaccines with that kind of statistic? I mean, it's absurd. And so yes, on some level, it's a very dark time, because you can't say things like that without them wanting to completely character assassinate you, even strip you of your license, even when it's so obvious. It's as obvious as day that there is a connection, and it's multifactorial. Of course, no one's saying any particular vaccine will cause autism in any particular person, but broadly speaking, you can't deny the reality. So yeah, there's some real, darkness out there right now, but then there's people like you, and there's people that are listening that are becoming very much aware of the truth, which is our body heals. Okay, we don't need chemicals to do that, and we don't even need oftentimes fancy, natural supplement pills, although I'm a big fan of using certain supplements. It's just our body is truly the primary healer.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing that you see. I mean, I don't think anyone comes into the world being anti-vaccination. I think we all start as being pro because, it makes a lot of sense. But as you start getting into it, I was having a conversation with a guy the other day, and he was like, look, there's no science. I don't know if you've seen the film, The Greater Good
Yes.
film, and then they have that whole science page, and I just emailed it to him, and I said, here, look, here's some science, at least to get started with. Like, the people who are anti it, it's not typically that they, the people who are pro-vaccine, the people that I've met, they have not even looked at this. They just, see what they see in the media, and they just say, well, you guys are insane. But, never has this information ever crossed their path. And I think when they see a page like that at that, or green mid-info, or the information you have, it's just such an obvious starting point that, look, there is science. You can qualify what science you think is good and what I think is good, but you don't get to 44th. I think it's 44th now in infant mortality without having something being seriously wrong. And not to look at that in the face, I think is tough, and that's why we do these kind of things. And I don't really want to spend all the time on vaccines because there's so many other things that are so important with the evidence base. What strikes me with this, and I just, as someone who's worked with a lot of people who are interested in quantum physics, if you observe something as a wave, then it behaves like a wave. And if you observe something as a particle, it behaves like a particle. And it seems to me that, if you set out with an intention to prove something right, you'll find a way to do it over, maybe a dozen experiments that go wrong, and then you don't have to report those because they're not important. But then you eventually find something and it's got just about enough to beat placebo, and then you're on your way to being a science rock star, and you're going through that. Do you think that? I mean, that surely plays a part in everything. That you look what you find what you look for.
Absolutely, and that's exactly the problem, is that, in 1900, Max Planck discovered the quantum of action, and since then, the whole burgeoning field of microphysics has revealed that, yes, the observer determines largely what is observed. So if it's light and you're looking at it as if it's a particle, it'll appear as a particle. If it's looking at it as a wave, it'll appear as a wave. That's complementarity, of course. And so the same applies to medical science. And absolutely, the evidence-based model is based on a classical Newtonian view of this observer who's value-free objective, has no bias, and then there's this objective world of things out there externally related to each other, and that's the only thing that's real. I mean, it's the most absurd and unscientific view of the universe that you could ever generate, and really all it does is recapitulate, natural assumptions, which are mainly false about the world, which is the macroscopic world we see that appears to be held together, by these forces, these classical forces. So yeah, no, you're right. Quantum mechanics and other, fields of insight have opened us up to the idea that no, there is no such thing. There's no just objective, reality of evidence that you can prove, mathematically and logically, and that my experience of healing or yours is as valid as some kind of double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, if it did happen. I'm not saying that you just make it up. If it happened, then it happened.
That's so interesting. One of the themes that's come up over and over again in this summit, Saya, is this move away from the evolution is going to be a move towards individualized medicine. And I think that that's obvious. And with this digital revolution happening as well, where we get a lot more data, I can see that that's only going to accelerate as well. But, the thing is, we've been so conditioned in reductionist science to be able to look for what is the best intervention for the most number of people. That's really what we're looking for with a drug. Like what compound or what dose, whatever, does the best for this certain group of people at fixing one particular symptom. And, it seems that now we're moving in towards an individualized type of strategy. How is the evidence base going to have to shift to reflect this new understanding of individualized medicine?
Well, it's so encouraging because, as you know, when the Human Genome Project ended, the first draft was completed in 2005. They were shocked to find there weren't enough genes in the human genome to describe all the proteins in the human body. So they found approximately 23,000 genes, and there's 100,000 different proteins. So that gap led to what has been called the post-genomic era, where now we realize that it's factors beyond the control of the gene, which are epigenetic factors related to diet and lifestyle, and even emotions can gear into physiology and affect the expression of the genes in the genome. So the whole thing points to the necessity of looking at phenotype, looking at biochemical individuality versus this ancient concept of there's just generic body. It's usually a Caucasian male body that they model it after, and that has everyone shares in the same reactions and same physiology. And so that's the beauty, I think, of functional medicine, particularly for me, is that it does address specifically our individuality. And if you don't, then you end up with, the type of conversation we had about vaccines, because no biochemical individuality screening occurs at all, no assessment. It's just the assumption is everyone on the planet could get HPV, so every single 9-year-old or older should get this vaccine. I mean, give me a break. That is the application of power. That is not medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. But how do you think practically that this will be, that the evidence will be taken from science, whatever that looks like? Maybe actually you could comment quickly on this new citizen science, because I think this is absolutely fascinating with things like 23andMe and Ubiome, where they're
Yes.
actually instigating the help of everyone to sort of chip in and create new science. Are you excited about that movement?
Absolutely. In fact, right the day that the FTC prevented 23andMe from doing their marketing of their product is when I sent mine in, and it was fascinating to receive back my results and discern I'm half Korean, but there's also now I see there's some Japanese in my genome, and it's just so fascinating to kind of get a sense for my own individuality and whatever SMPs might be getting in the way of some type of chemical that could be affecting me. It's very important information. So I'm excited by the movement, and I think that that's ultimately why Green Med Info has become popular. It's not really so much other than the fact that people realize that there is research available, and it's there through taxpayer money on government site, and so they can go direct to the source of primary literature, because any physician in a busy practice, I mean, bless them if they have time to do research or read an article. They're not going to have the time, so we're going to have to take responsibility for our health and do more of this research ourselves, and of course work with folks who can liaison and help to interpret it accurately. And so that's the citizen science movement sounds great.
Yeah, it was really exciting to hear from them, because one thing, not only are you getting this basic bulk of information on the biome or the genome, whatever it is, but the ability then in the new digital era to to solicit a questionnaire from people who have been in the group, get their feedback, and then apply that. I think when I saw her speak at South by Southwest, she said that they were able to get 12,000 responses in like 12 minutes or something like that, something crazy amount, where anyone who's done any sort of like scientific response knows to get 12,000 responses from any list of anything, it's like,
Yeah.
it's ridiculous. You have to have so much, and it takes so much time and so much money and so much effort and whatever. Here's a situation where we're now actually to be able to get, that much more information more quickly. So, this opens up big possibilities for being able to do science at a speed that we've never been able to do it, because of the responses that we can get from people whose data we already have.
Yes, yes, it's amazing. I mean, it's truly a miracle, the technology available to us to, take back control of our health, and, the information is sort of a democracy currency, and that's really what this is all about, I think.
Definitely. Well, one other thing that I've been interested in for a long time, since I read this book. I don't know if you've read it. It's called White Coat, Black Hat. Have you read that?
Mm-mm.
It's by Carl Elliott, and he talked about, just really, the question he asked was, when we're doing these clinical trials, who exactly is in these clinical trials, and what else are they doing at the same time? I used to live in New Haven, Connecticut, and I would see, these signs up to do the clinical trials, and you have to think, well, who's doing them? It seems like mainly like poor students and homeless people. And
Yeah.
then you've got, like you said, the ghostwriting, where people are just, the sort of edge of marketing and science is extremely blurred through these different types of journals.
Hmm.
Now that this is all sort of coming out, people are realizing that that there's a lot more marketing than science going on. How do you think, what will be the gold standards for integrity in the new evidence base?
Well, I think primarily people want to see that their physician or their educator is themselves living that life, and they're, really focusing on their own health. So that's a big part of it, I think. It's kind of hard sometimes to just look at it as, oh, this person has superior information. We want people to be integrating it and supporting healthy practices like organic farming, et cetera, just really living it. But when it comes to evidence, I think again, just knowing that they're open and receptive to the fact that there is this vast volume of data that we couldn't expect any quote, priest of the body, if we have this authority, this cult of authority to know that this is the best intervention at this moment in time for me. It's got to be a dialogue, and it has to be a sort of an open process where really the patient, again, I think has to start taking far more responsibility for their health.
So you see the future as basically patients taking primary responsibility and seeking out those people who have proven out through their own living that they know what healthy is, and looking for guidance and support.
Ideally, I think it's important that we find those who are really embodying a healthy lifestyle, and that we do our best to stay out of an unnecessary office visit, because that's the ultimate testimony as to whether we are living a healthy life, is not being dependent on constant medical intervention and medical surveillance, because, that's unfortunately a lot of what happens.
Yeah, and you'll see more of that as the wearable market grows and as people are, getting more information all the time,
Hmm.
initially from themselves to their smartphone, and then maybe from themselves to their doctor, and then maybe from themselves to their peers, depending on, what kind of disease they're dealing with and what the most effective way for dealing with it is. I mean, I guess that's so like maybe the last thing that we could chat about here, Sarah, is what do you see, when you look out and you see the kind of groups that are reversing chronic disease, like functional medicine, the Saddleback Church with what Mark Hyman's doing? It
Yeah.
seems like there's actually value in putting people together and people connecting with each other, to move forward. Like obesity seems to be, contagious in a certain way, and so health as well. What do you see as sort of like these factors coming into medicine that have never really been part of medicine at all? It's always been just sort of like you and the doctor coming together. Do you see some hope in this part of the evolution?
Yeah, because I think that it's primarily, we're going to see the most beneficial changes in medicine be through education and just make available. You can have a dialogue and you can discuss things openly and reference research and try to understand it, and share experiences, because ultimately, the model, of, again, supplicating for special knowledge from a particular authority, although that's absolutely appropriate, I think generally people need to be liberated of that power structure, because the clinical space in many ways can also be almost like it was with the medicine man, the shaman. We have put so much faith in their perceptions and, even supplements, that sometimes there's this placebo nocebo dynamic that is really causing, the benefit. And so I think people just need to kind of free themselves as much as possible from that, and really do more education.
Yeah, no, I think that people can get a lot of benefit out of that. We got another talk on the summit, just about the empowerment being the new compliance, and essentially how doctors and practitioners can really play a role in stimulating that out of people, stimulating the placebo effect, getting trust, getting, you
Mhm.
know,
Yes.
getting people to follow through with what they want to do. Everyone has an unlimited list of stuff that they wish they were doing that they're not doing, when it comes to their health, and just engaging people into that and being in a process with them of helping them to understand, what's
Yes.
going on, and thinking it through and being supportive. It seems like there's a definite power in the relationship between the practitioner and the
Yeah.
patient, but what we're seeing is that it's moving away from this sort of patriarchal power
Mhm.
to more of a sort of a team empowerment model.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. Because if you, as a physician, have gone through a healing experience, or you know that a condition can resolve using, these integrative approaches, you can convey that hope to the person who's coming to you. But if you're conveying the opposite, and the prognosis that you're projecting is very negative, then obviously that's going to really affect someone who's already diseased. They're already susceptible to, being weaker and impressionable. So again, I think it's important to find help from people who have really learned what healing is, and also really have practical knowledge of the topic.
Exactly. Well, Say, it's been so great to be with you here today, and thank you so much for your time. Say, if you guys are as impressed with Say as I am, you can find out all of his information at greenmedinfo.com. There are studies, there's all kinds of information there about finding some of this. It's extremely well indexed. Say, I really
Yeah.
wanted to have an understanding of this evolution of the medical evidence base that's happening now as we speak, and I appreciate your thoughts on delivering that. Anything else that you'd like to leave our audience with today?
Well, just thank you. It's an honor to be part of this. And of course, yeah, I would just encourage people to always use Medline, pubmed.gov, as a way to kind of measure and balance out the information you're hearing out there, because it's a helpful tool. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, great to be with you, and we'll see you next time.